I passed through Heron Falls on a Tuesday in late October, when the maples had gone the color of old rust and the sky sat low and gray over everything. I had stopped for gas and maybe coffee and ended up staying 2 nights without ever quite deciding to. The town was quiet in a particular way. Not peaceful. Quiet the way a room goes quiet when you have said something wrong. People moved through their routines, opened their shops, nodded at me on the sidewalk. But there was a quality to all of it, a careful economy of movement, as though everyone had agreed not to look too hard at anything. I noticed a field on my second morning. It sat at the edge of town where the road bent south toward nothing, just a wide flat stretch of pale grass behind a low wooden fence. No house, no barn, no sign. The ground inside it was darker than it should have been, and the grass grew in a way that troubled me when I looked at it directly, though I could not have said exactly why. I asked the woman at the diner about it. She refilled my coffee and smiled at the counter and said she had lived here all her life and could not think of what field I meant. Her voice was perfectly even when she said it. That afternoon, I drove past again, and there was a boy of maybe 10 standing at the fence, just standing there with both hands resting on the top rail, looking in. He did not look at me when I slowed. He did not move at all. I left before dark and took the long way out, the one that curved away from that end of town entirely. I told myself it was faster. Our next story. I found a town by accident, the way you find most things worth finding. My car had been pulling to the right for 50 miles, and I stopped in Caldwell Hollow just as the sky went the color of old pewter. The main street was short and quiet, 3 or 4 storefronts, a gas station with one working pump, and a diner with a hand-lettered sign in the window that said simply, "Open." Inside, the warmth was heavy and close, and the smell of coffee and fried onions settled over me like something familiar. There were 4 people at the counter, and none of them turned when I came in. The woman who brought my coffee had kind eyes and a careful way of moving, deliberate, like someone had learned to take up very little space. I noticed the building across the street while I ate. It was set slightly back from the others, 2 stories, pale, clabbered gone gray with weather. Every window was covered from the inside with brown paper, and the paper was neat and even, not haphazard, as though the covering had been done with some care and intention. There was no sign on the building. The front walk was swept clean. I asked the woman with the careful way of moving what the building was used for. She refilled my coffee and said it was nothing, just an old place. The man 2 stools down shifted on his seat, but said nothing. A conversation at the far table quietly stopped. I looked back through the diner window before I left. The sky had gone darker, and a single light had appeared somewhere behind the brown paper of one of the upper windows, faint and still, like something that had been waiting there for a long time to be noticed. I drove on without looking back. Our next story. I stopped in Millhaven for gas sometime after midnight, the kind of small town that exists mostly as a suggestion along a state highway. 1 pump, 1 light buzzing above it, a convenience store with fogged windows and a handwritten sign that said simply, "Open." The man behind the counter was older, thin through the shoulders, and he watched me the way people watch weather moving in from the west. I bought coffee and asked, the way travelers do, whether there was anything worth seeing around here. He set my change on the counter instead of in my hand. There used to be a reservoir, he said, about 4 miles east. They drained it some years back. I said that sounded interesting and asked what they found when the water went down. He looked past me at the dark window. Nothing, he said. That was the problem. I did not press him. Some answers close a door, and you learn to leave it that way. I drove out there anyway because I could not help myself. The road east was unmarked and narrow, the trees leaning in close on both sides, and after 4 miles the asphalt simply ended at a chain-link fence. Beyond it, in the pale reach of my headlights, I could see the basin. It was enormous and perfectly dry, and the bottom was cracked into pale, geometric shapes like something drawn by a careful hand. There were no birds, no insects, a stillness that felt less like quiet and more like listening. I stood at the fence for a long time without understanding why I could not move. There was nothing to see. That was exactly it. A thing that large should have left something behind, some trace, some residue of all those years underwater. But the basin held nothing at all, and somehow that was the part one kept thinking about long after I left. Our next story. I drove into Sallow Creek just before dusk when the sky had gone that particular shade of gray that makes everything look faded and old. I was looking for a motel, nothing more, and the town seemed like any other town at first. A hardware store with a hand-painted sign, a diner with fog windows, a row of houses set back from the road behind lawns that needed tending. I ate alone at the diner, and the waitress was kind enough, refilling my coffee without being asked. But when I mentioned the empty lot I had noticed on the main road, the one with the concrete foundation still visible beneath the weeds, she set the pot down and looked at the window instead of at me. She said I had been there a long time. She said nothing else about it. Later, I walked the main street in the cooling air, and I noticed that every house on the east side of town had its curtains drawn on the windows that faced a certain direction. Not closed for privacy, but closed in a way that felt deliberate, like a habit passed down without explanation. An older man was sweeping his porch, and I waved. He waved back, but his eyes moved past me to something over my shoulder, and his sweeping slowed, and then he went inside. That night, I lay in the motel room and listened to the quiet. It was a deep quiet, the kind that feels like something holding its breath. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a low sound from somewhere outside. Not quite a hum, not quite a voice, more like the memory of a sound. I got up and looked through the curtain. The east side of town was dark. Every window. All at once. I left before sunrise, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. Our next story. I stayed 2 nights in Dunmore because my car needed a part that had to be ordered from somewhere else. The mechanic said tomorrow, then said it again the next morning, and I got the feeling he wasn't entirely sorry about the delay. The town sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, the kind of place where sound moved strangely, where a voice from across the street arrived a half-second late, like an echo looking for its source. There was one diner, a hardware store with a faded awning, and a church at the end of the main road that I never once saw open. On my first afternoon, I walked the length of town and noticed something I couldn't quite name. Every house had its curtains drawn on the north-facing windows. Every single one. I thought it was coincidence until I counted. I asked the woman at the diner about it, keeping my voice light, the way you do when you don't want to seem strange for noticing. She refilled my coffee without looking up and said she didn't know what I meant. That evening I sat on the small porch of the motel and watched the ridge to the north as the light left it. Nothing moved up there. No trees, no birds, nothing I could name. Just a long dark line against the dimming sky, and below it the back windows of every house in Dunmore staring at anything else. The mechanic called at 7 the next morning to say my part had arrived. He had it installed by 9. He shook my hand firmly, the way people do when they're genuinely glad something is ending. I drove south out of the valley, and I didn't look in my rearview mirror, though I'm not sure I could have explained why. Our next story. I came to Ashfield looking for someone who had stopped returning my calls. She had moved there the previous spring, said it was quiet and affordable, and that she needed a change. I believed her. I drove up on a gray Saturday in November, when the fields on either side of the highway had gone the color of old straw, and the sky sat low and close like a hell breath. The town was small enough that you could walk its main street in under 10 minutes. A diner, a hardware store, a post office with its flag beaten thin by seasons. I asked at the diner if anyone knew where my friend had settled, gave her name gently, the way you offer something fragile. The woman behind the counter set down the coffee pot very slowly and told me she didn't recall anyone by that name. The two men at the far table didn't look up, but they went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I walked to the rental office, to the small library, to the church at the edge of town with its unpainted steps. The same thing happened everywhere. A careful stillness, a slight rearrangement of expression, a polite and total refusal. What stayed with me was not the silence itself, but the consistency of it. No one was rude. No one seemed frightened. They all simply looked at me with something I could only describe as patience, as though they had waited for someone like me before and knew exactly how long before I would give up and leave. I drove out as the light failed. In my mirror, the town sat flat and gray against the tree lean, and I noticed that not a single window had come on, though it was nearly dark, and the road ahead of me was very long. Our next story. The road to Veltham took me through 40 miles of pine forest, and by the time I arrived the afternoon light had already gone thin and pale, the way it does in places that sit too far from anything else. I was passing through, nothing more. A one-night stop before the long stretch north. The motel sat at the edge of town, a low brown building with a vacancy sign that buzzed faintly in the still air. The woman at the desk handed me my key without looking up, and when I asked about a place to eat, she pointed down the main road and said the diner closed at 7. Nothing else. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and old wood. I sat at the counter and watched a few other patrons eat in quiet, their eyes moving toward the window every so often, then away again. I followed their gaze once, but saw only the empty street, the dark storefronts, a single amber light swinging slowly on a wire though there was no wind. I asked my waitress, an older woman with careful hands, what was down at the far end of town, past where the streetlight stopped. I had seen a structure there when I arrived, tall and narrow, set back from the road. She refilled my coffee and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said it was an old granary, long empty. I nodded and let it sit there between us. Walking back to the motel that night, I paused on the main road and looked toward that far end of town. The structure was dark against the darker sky, but there was a faint glow somewhere inside it, soft and amber, like a single lamp left burning in a room no one was meant to enter. I kept walking and did not look back. Our next story. I passed through Grover's Bend on a Wednesday in early March, when the last of the winter snow had turned gray and soft along the roadsides. I needed a room for the night and found one above a hardware store, run by a woman who handed me the key without once meeting my eyes. The town sat in a low valley between two hills, and the hills had a way of holding the sound in. Footsteps carried farther than they should have. Voices arrived before the people who owned them. I noticed early on that no one in Grover's Bend looked up when they walked, not the man outside the diner, not the children moving in a loose group toward the school, not the old woman sitting very still on her porch despite the cold. At dinner, I asked the waitress about the field on the eastern edge of town, the one I had driven past, ringed with orange survey stakes that looked months old. She refilled my coffee and said it was nothing, just nothing, in the particular way people say a word twice when they want it to stop meaning anything. I walked out there after dark because I could not help it. The field was flat and wide, and the soil had been turned at some point, then left. The survey stakes formed a perfect rectangle. Inside the rectangle, there was nothing. Outside it, at the four corners, someone had placed small flat stones. I could not tell if they were marking something or keeping it in place. When I returned to the room, I noticed the curtains in the house across the street fall closed. A light moved slowly through the rooms beyond, pausing at each window as it passed, the way a person does when they are checking that everything is still where they left it. Our next story. I lingered in Colbert for 3 days longer than I meant to, waiting for a storm to pass that never quite arrived. The clouds sat low and still over everything, the color of old pewter, and the air had that particular heaviness that makes sounds seem closer than they are. The town was small enough that strangers were noticed. People were polite in a way that kept distance, nodding from porches, holding doors without making eye contact. I ate my meals at the same diner each morning and listened to the radio murmur weather reports that never matched what was outside. On the second afternoon, I walked the long way back from the post office and past the gap between two buildings where a narrow lane ran down toward a concrete lot. There was a row of wooden posts at the far end, evenly spaced, each one roughly the same height. I counted 11 of them before I realized I had stopped walking. That evening, I asked the woman at the front desk of the motel what the posts were for. She was folding towels and did not stop folding them. She said she was not sure what I meant. I described where I had seen them, and she said that lane had been closed off for years. She said in the tone people use when a subject is finished. I did not press her. I had learned by then that pressing did not work in Colbert. On my last morning, the storm finally broke. Thin, cold rain that made the streets shine. I packed my bag and drove out slowly, and at the edge of town, I passed a hardware store with 11 fence posts stacked neatly against its outer wall. Fresh ones, still pale, still raw-smelling, I imagined, waiting to be used somewhere. I did not stop to count them again. Our next story. The motel in Calver sat at the edge of town, close enough to the tree line that the pines pressed against the window glass at night. I had booked 2 nights because the nearest city was hours in any direction, and I was tired in a way that sleep had stopped fixing. The woman at the front desk gave me a key on a heavy brass ring and pointed down a narrow hall without meeting my eyes. I noticed the photographs on my second morning. They lined the corridor of the local diner, black and white prints of Calver through the decades, the storefronts and the church, and the wide, unpaved main street. In most of them, the residents were gathered in loose clusters, smiling or squinting into old light. But in a photograph near the end of the hall, dated 1961, everyone in the frame had turned away from the camera. Every single person, facing the tree line at the edge of town, their backs straight, and their arms at their sides, like they were listening for something just beyond the photograph. I asked the man refilling my coffee what had happened that day. He set the pot down slowly, looked at the picture for a long moment, and then looked at me the way people look at children who have asked something they're too young to understand. He said it was nothing, just a photographer with bad timing. I walked the town that afternoon and noticed that none of the houses on the western edge had windows facing the trees. They had been boarded over or bricked in some cases so long ago that the mortar had grown pale and smooth. Nobody was outside on that side of town. The street was very quiet, and the pines stood very still, and somewhere inside one of those sealed houses, I thought I heard something move. Our next story. I spent 4 days in Orval because the bridge out of town was being repaired, or so the woman at the front desk told me, smiling in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. The town was small and orderly in the way that feels practiced rather than natural. Clean storefronts, swept sidewalks, flower boxes that had been tended long past the season for flowers. People moved through their routines with a kind of deliberate calm, like actors who had been performing the same quiet play for years and no longer needed to think about it. On my second evening, I walked past a house at the end of Marker Street where every window had been painted over from the inside. White paint, thick and careful. I mentioned it at dinner to the man who ran the diner, just casually, the way you mentioned something curious. He set down the coffee pot very slowly and told me the house had been empty for some time. I said the paint looked recent. He brought my check without saying anything else. I asked a few other people over the following days, And each time there was that same small pause before the subject was changed. A pause that lasted just a beat too long, the way silence does when someone is deciding how much to say. On my last morning, I walked past Marker Street again. It was early and the light was thin and gray. One of the upper windows had a thin line at its edge where the paint had been scraped away from the inside. Just a narrow strip, dark against the white. I did not stop walking. The bridge was open by afternoon, and I left Orval without looking back, though I am not entirely sure why that felt important. Our next story. I pulled into Mercy Flats on a gray November afternoon. Following a detour that had added 2 hours to a drive I was already tired of. The town was smaller than the map suggested, a single main street with a hardware store, a diner, and a post office that looked like it had not been painted since before I was born. I ordered coffee at the diner and sat by the window. The street outside was quiet in that particular way small towns get quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but careful. 3 or 4 people moved along the sidewalk, and every one of them kept their eyes low. There was a house at the end of the street. I noticed it because there was no way not to. It sat slightly apart from everything else, a tall, narrow thing with dark windows, and every person who walked past it crossed to the other side of the road without breaking their stride, without looking up, as if the habit had been worn so deep into them, it had become instinct. I asked the woman behind the counter about it, keeping my voice easy and casual. She refilled my cup without meeting my eyes and said only that it had been empty a long time. I tried again later with the man at the hardware store. He looked at me for a moment with something that was not quite pity and not quite warning. And then he turned and began organizing a shelf that did not need organizing. That night, I sat in my car at the far end of the street and watched the house for a while. The windows stayed dark. Nothing moved. But twice I saw people on the sidewalk stop walking and tilt their heads as though listening for something before they hurried on. I never heard what they heard. I left early the next morning and did not look back at it. Our next story. The ferry to Caswell Island ran once a day, and I missed it by 10 minutes. The man at the dock said nothing when I asked about the next one. He just looked out at the water, at the low gray shape of the island sitting maybe a quarter-mile offshore, and after a long moment, he told me there was a room above the hardware store I could take for the night. The town was small and orderly and very quiet. I walked the main street in the early afternoon and counted maybe a dozen people, all of them polite, all of them brief. Nobody asked what my business was on the island. Nobody mentioned the island at all, even when I brought it up directly, even when I pointed to it through the diner window, where it sat visible and close in the flat November light. I ate alone. The coffee was good, and the pie was good, and the woman behind the counter refilled my cup twice without being asked. When I asked her what was over there, she set the coffee pot down and looked at the window for a moment, and then told me the weather had been hard this year. At night, I lay in the room above the hardware store and listened to the silence. There were no boats going out. I had expected to hear them, the small engine sounds carrying over the water in the dark, but there was nothing. Just the occasional creak of the building, and somewhere below me the faint smell of paint and old wood. In the morning I could not see the island. The water was clear, and the sky was clear, and the place where it had been was simply open channel, as though it had never been there at all. I took the first ferry out of town. I did not ask anyone about it. Our next story. I came to Whetstone in February, following a route that no longer exists on newer maps. The town sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, the kind of place that feels like it was pressed down into the earth by something heavy and never quite recovered. I needed a room for the night. The woman at the front desk of the only motel handed me a key without looking up, and when I mentioned the cluster of small white crosses I had passed on the road coming in, she set her pen down very slowly and said she wouldn't know anything about that. There were 7 crosses. I had counted them. In the morning, I walked to the diner on the main street and ordered coffee. The people there were quiet in a way that felt deliberate, The way a room goes quiet when someone enters who should not be there. I asked the man refilling my cup whether the town had always been this small. He said it had been smaller once. He did not say more than that. I noticed sometime around noon that none of the locals looked directly at the ridge to the east. They would stand on the sidewalk facing north or south or west, and when their eyes moved, they moved carefully, the way you learn not to look at something that has looked back. I drove out that afternoon. About a mile past the crosses, I pulled over and sat with the engine running, watching the ridge in my rearview mirror. The tree line up there was perfectly still, even though the grass along the road was moving in the wind. I do not know what Whetstone is keeping quiet about. I only know that the quiet felt practiced and old, and that everyone in that town had learned it young. Our next story. I booked a room in Pallor for one night, passing through on my way somewhere I no longer remember. The town sat in a low valley between two ridge lines, the kind of place that fog settled into and never quite left, even on clear afternoons. The streets were tidy enough, the houses well kept, and the people I met at the diner were perfectly polite in the way that people are when they have decided in advance not to tell you anything. There was a church at the far end of Main Street with no windows. Not boarded windows, just smooth brick where the glass should have been, as though windows had never been part of the plan. I mentioned it to the woman who brought my coffee. She refilled my cup and changed the subject so gently I almost did not notice she had done it. That evening I walked the perimeter of town in the last of the gray light. I found a small park with a gazebo and 6 concrete benches arranged in a circle, each one facing inward toward a bare patch of earth where I would have expected a fountain or a monument. The ground there was darker than the soil around it, and perfectly smooth, as though it had been carefully tended, or as though nothing had ever grown there and never would. I slept badly. Sometime before dawn I heard what I thought was singing coming from the direction of the church. Very low, more felt than heard, the kind of sound that lives in the chest rather than the ears. When I went to the window, there was nothing to see but fog and the orange smear of a single streetlight. I left before breakfast. The road climbed out of the valley quickly, and when I looked in the mirror, the town had already gone quiet below the mist. Our next story. The train stopped in Beckett for 40 minutes, and I was the only one who got off. It was a Thursday in early September, warm enough still that the air felt heavy and used up. The platform was empty. A single bulb hung above the station door, and moths turned slow circles around it in the fading light. I walked into town because I had time and nothing else to do with it. The main street was 3 blocks long, lined with shops that seemed open but felt otherwise. A hardware store, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, a post office with its flag hanging perfectly still in air that should have moved it. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee and sat by the window. The woman who brought it to me had the careful, practiced manner of someone who had learned long ago to give nothing away. I asked her because I was curious and because the town had a particular quality of quiet I could not quite name, whether anything interesting ever happened here. She refilled my cup without looking at me. I watched the street while I drank. At the far end, where the road curved toward the tree line, there was a gap between 2 buildings. A narrow path led into shadow, and in front of it someone had placed a row of smooth white stones along the ground. They were evenly spaced, deliberate, like something meant to mark a boundary rather than decorate it. A man at the counter noticed me looking. He turned back to his food without a word. I left before my 40 minutes were up and sat on the platform until the train returned. No one else came out to wait. The moths were still circling when the light behind me finally switched off on its own. Our next story. I rented a room in Solon for a week in early September, when the heat had just begun to soften at the edges. It was a quiet town, the kind where the streets empty before 8, and the only sound by 9 is the slow tick of cooling pavement. On my 3rd morning, I noticed the field. It sat at the far end of Callaway Street, behind a low fence that had once been white. The grass inside grew tall and pale, almost silver, in a way that made it look older than the grass everywhere else. There were flowers too, small and without color, arranged in rows so even they could not have been wild. I asked the woman at the hardware store about it. She handed me my change and looked briefly out the window before she said she did not know what I was referring to. Her voice was careful, the way a person sounds when they have practiced not answering a question. I asked the man who ran the diner. He refilled my coffee and told me the weather was turning, and that was the whole of his reply. The field had no gate that I could find. The fence ran unbroken all the way around, and the posts were sunk deep, the kind of deep that takes intention. On my last evening, I walked past it again just before dark. The pale grass had gone still, even though there was a wind moving through the rest of the town. I stood there for a long time, watching the flowers in their neat and colorless rows, and I had the feeling, quiet but persistent, that whatever those rows marked, it was not a garden. I left the following morning without asking anyone else. Some questions settle into you more completely when they go unanswered. Our next story. I arrived in Dunwich Hollow on the tail end of a rainy April, following a highway that had narrowed itself down to a single lane without any sign to mark the change. The town appeared gradually, the way fog thickens, buildings materializing out of the wet gray air one at a time. A hardware store, a diner with its lights on, but no cars outside. A post office with a flag that hung perfectly still despite the wind. I went into the diner to get warm. The woman behind the counter brought me coffee without asking and stood with her back to me for a long time, looking at something through the rain-streaked window. I asked her what had happened to the old mill I had passed on the road in, the one with the collapsed roof and the yellow tape around its perimeter, old enough that the tape had faded to nearly white. She refilled my cup. I tried again at the hardware store, mentioning that I had seen flowers left near the mill, a whole row of them propped against the remaining wall, recent enough that the petals had not yet dropped. The man there found something to do in the back room. That evening I walked out to the mill alone. The rain had stopped, and the air had gone very cold and still. The flowers were there as I'd seen them, 24 at least, all white, none of them with any card or ribbon. Inside the collapsed walls, where the roof had caved and the floor had rotted through, there was a square of bare earth about the size of a door, and nothing grew there, not a weed, not a blade of grass, though everything around it was thick with spring. I left early the next morning. I did not ask anyone else. Our next story. I stayed in Voss for 11 days because the landlady at the boarding house charged by the week, and I had already paid. The town sat in a low valley between two softly sloping hills, the kind of place that always seemed to be in shadow, even when the sun was high. There were maybe 400 people living there, a general store, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon, and a church whose bell never rang. I noticed a field on my second morning. It lay just beyond the last row of houses, a wide flat stretch of pale grass that no one had touched in what looked like years. There was nothing unusual about it, exactly, but the town had arranged itself so that no window faced it. Every house on that side of Voss had its curtains drawn on the eastern wall. I asked the man at the general store about it, casually, the way you ask about weather or road conditions. He put down what he was holding and looked at me for a long moment before saying that he didn't know what I meant. At the diner, I tried again, asking an older woman who had been kind to me about local history. She smiled and poured my coffee and spoke about the founding families and the mild winters and never once paused long enough for me to redirect her. I walked out to the field on my 9th evening. The grass was dry and very still. I stood at the edge of it and looked toward the center where the ground seemed very slightly lower than the rest, as if something beneath it had settled. Behind me, I heard a door close, then another. Then the whole street went quiet in a way that felt less like silence and more like hell breath. I left the next morning before the landlady was awake. Our next story. The bus dropped me in Hales Crossing on a gray Thursday in November when the fields had gone flat and colorless and the sky sat low over everything like a hell breath. I needed a room for a few nights, nothing more. The woman at the front desk of the only motel handed me a key without looking up, and when I asked about a good place to eat, she told me the diner on Clement Street and nothing else. The diner was warm and nearly empty. An old man in a green coat sat at the counter with his coffee, and two women shared a booth near the window, speaking in voices too quiet to follow. I ordered soup and ate slowly, watching the street outside, where almost no one passed. I noticed the photograph on the wall behind the register. A group of townspeople, maybe 40 of them, standing in front of a large building I did not recognize. The building did not appear anywhere else in town that I could find. I asked the woman who refilled my coffee what the building had been. She looked at the photograph for a moment, then back at me. Then she picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter. That night, I walked the quieter end of town and found the foundation. Just concrete and weeds and a rectangle of scorched earth where something had stood. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to explain it. The grass around the edges had grown back unevenly, as though it had happened not so long ago. In the morning, I asked the motel woman the same question I had asked to the diner. She handed me my receipt without speaking and held the door open until I walked through it. I drove out of Hales Crossing shortly after 9. The fields watched me go. Our next story. I wandered into Kettlemore on a Sunday in late November, when the last of the leaves had finally given up and the ground was soft with something that was not quite mud. I had been driving back roads for 2 days, the kind of roads that appear on old paper maps, but not on any screen, and Kettlemore appeared the way a thought appears just before sleep, quiet and sudden and already familiar. I stopped at a diner on the main street because the lights were on and I was cold. The woman behind the counter poured my coffee without asking and set a slice of pie beside it without a word. The 3 other people in the room did not look up. The television in the corner was on, but muted, showing weather for a region I did not recognize. I asked the woman, gently, about the church at the end of the street. It was a large building for such a small town, and all its windows had been covered from the inside with brown paper. She topped off my coffee and moved away. One of the other patrons, an older man in a canvas jacket, leaned slightly forward. He did not look at me. He said, in a voice barely above a murmur, that it had been closed for a long time. He said nothing else. No one else spoke. I finished my coffee and left a few dollars on the counter and walked back to my car in the early dark. I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The church at the end of the street had no lights on, but as I looked at it, one of the brown paper sheets shifted against a window from the inside, slowly and without hurry, as though something behind it had simply leaned close. I drove until the town was gone behind me. Our next story. I found work in Kowloon for 3 weeks in early spring, painting the exterior of a house on the far side of town. The family had moved away the previous autumn, the agency told me, and left the property in someone else's care. I did not ask whose. The town itself was quiet in a way that felt practiced, like silence people had learned to hold inside their mouths. The diner where I ate each morning kept the radio low, and the conversations around me never quite reached full volume. People spoke in the register of church halls and waiting rooms. On my 4th evening, I walked past the elementary school and noticed it had no playground, no swings, no equipment of any kind. Just a wide, flat rectangle of packed dirt behind the chain-link fence, and at the center of it, a single concrete square with iron brackets set into the surface, as though something had once been bolted there and removed. I mentioned it to the woman at the hardware store the next morning, idly, the way you mentioned weather. She handed me my change and looked at a point just past my shoulder. She said it had been a while since anyone used that yard. She said children these days prefer to stay inside. She did not say anything else. I found myself going back to look at that concrete square each evening on my walk home. The iron brackets were old, thick with rust, the bolts long gone. Whatever they had held was gone too, and the earth around them was pressed down harder than the rest, the way ground gets when people have stood on it for a long time, waiting. I finished the job. I drove out of Kowloon on a clear March morning without stopping for breakfast. Some silences are not meant to be filled. Our next story. I came to Fenwick on a Sunday in late January, following a road that my map showed as a main route, but which narrowed to a single lane within the first mile. The town appeared slowly, the way cold towns do, a water tower first, then a church steeple, then low rooftops pressed against a colorless sky. I needed a room and found one above the hardware store, rented to me by a man named Aldous who counted my money twice and did not ask where I was headed. The room smelled of cedar and something older, something that reminded me of standing water in a place that rarely saw sun. On my second morning, I noticed the field at the edge of town. It was flat and brown and unremarkable, ringed by a low wire fence that seemed more ceremonial than practical. No one walked near it. The children who cut through town on their way to school took the long way around, adding several minutes to a walk that clearly bored them. I asked the woman at the diner about it. She refilled my coffee and told me the pie that day was apple. I asked the man reading a newspaper by the window. He turned a page. I asked Aldous, and he looked at the floor for a moment before saying that some fields just do not get used. On my last night, I lay in bed listening to the town settle into quiet, and I thought I heard something from the direction of that field. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of a sound a place should make, a silence that was too careful, too arranged, as though something in the dark was being very deliberate about not being heard. I left before first light. I did not take the photograph I had planned to. Our next story. I spent a long weekend in Carafe because a friend had mentioned the fishing and then never mentioned it again when I brought it up afterward. The town sat low in a river valley, the kind of place that collects fog the way old houses collect dust. And by the first evening I understood that something about it was not quite right. The streets were quiet in a way that felt chosen rather than natural. People moved through them with their eyes slightly downcast, not unfriendly exactly, but careful, the way you are careful around a subject you have agreed not to raise. I ate at the only diner and asked the woman behind the counter about a boarded storefront I had passed on the main road, its windows painted over in a dark green that had begun to peel. She refilled my coffee and said it had been empty a long time. I asked how long. She set the pot down and smiled at something just past my shoulder and said she honestly could not remember. On the second day, I walked along the river path and came to a place where the reeds had been flattened in a wide circle, very old, the stems grown back pale and thin like hair after an illness. A child's rubber boot sat at the edge of the circle, half sunk in the mud, pointing toward the water. I stood there for a while, and the river moved past me, and nothing happened, and that was almost worse. That evening I asked my landlord about the history of the town. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window, and then he said that Carafe had always been a peaceful place. He said it the way people say things they have been saying for so long they no longer hear the words. I left the next morning before the fog had lifted. Our next story. I stayed in Mournes Inn for 5 days in early December, waiting for a storm system to pass before I could continue north. The town was small enough that I walked its full length in under 20 minutes, past a hardware store and a diner and a post office with a flag that hung motionless even when the wind was blowing. On the second day, I noticed the lake. It sat at the edge of town, just beyond the last row of houses, and it was the kind of still water that looks painted rather than real. No docks, no reeds along the bank. A dock extended maybe 30 feet out, and at the end of it sat a wooden chair facing the water, weathered and ordinary, as if someone had left it there and simply never returned. I mentioned it to the woman who ran the diner, asked if people fished out there. She set down the coffee pot and looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something slightly wrong in polite company. She said the lake was fine and refilled my cup and moved away to a booth that needed wiping. I asked the man at the hardware store. He paused, then told me the lake had always been there and left it at that. That night, I lay in the narrow bed at the motel and listened to the silence, which was deeper than it should have been for a town with roads and trees and winter wind. I thought about the chair. I thought about how no one in Mourne's End had ever said the lake's name, only the town's, as though the water did not belong to the same place. On the 5th day, the storm cleared and I drove north. I have never been able to find Mourne's End on any map since, though I have looked quietly and more than once. Our next story. I arrived in Sable Crossing on a gray afternoon in mid-November when the fields on either side of the highway had gone the color of old straw and the clouds sat low and still over everything. I needed a room for the night and found one above a hardware store, rented to me by a woman who took my money without quite looking at my face. The room was clean and cold, and the window faced the main street, which was mostly empty. I ate dinner at the only diner still open. The other patrons sat quietly over their plates, and the conversation among them was careful and small. I asked the woman refilling my coffee what had happened to the grain elevator at the edge of town, the one with the windows boarded and the door chained shut, the one that seemed too new for such careful abandonment. She set the coffee pot down and looked at the table beside mine, not at me. Nothing happened to it, she said. It just closed. I walked past it before bed, because the night was dry and I had nothing else to do. The structure was enormous up close, pale against the dark sky, and there was a smell near it I could not name, something cold and faintly sweet like rain on dry earth, but wrong in a way I could not explain. The chain on the door was new. The padlock still had its paper tag. In the morning, the woman at the hardware store was gone, and a man I had not seen before handed me my receipt without speaking. I drove out of Sable Crossing along the same road I'd come in on, and in my rearview mirror the elevator stood pale and still at the edge of town, watching the way the dead watch, which is to say without any expression at all. Our next story. I found work in Grieve for 2 weeks in late September, patching rooftops before the cold settled in. It was the kind of town that looked fine from the road, neat houses and a diner and a hardware store with hand-painted letters on the window, but something sat wrong in it the way a picture sits wrong when it is hung just slightly off level. There was a field at the northern edge of town behind the grain elevator, fenced off with old posts and wire that had gone the color of rust. Nothing grew in it. Not weeds, not grass, not the scrubby volunteer trees that take over every neglected patch of ground in that part of the country. Just bare soil, pale and dry, even after the rains we had that first week. I asked about it at the diner one morning. The woman who brought my coffee set the mug down carefully and looked past my shoulder for a moment before she said she didn't know anything about that field. The man at the next table kept his eyes on his plate. The conversation in the booth behind me went quiet and then started back up about something else entirely. I tried again with the man I was working for, a slow-talking fellow named Gerald who seemed easy enough on other subjects. He listened to my question, scratched the back of his neck, and said that field had been like that as long as anyone could remember, and that some things were just better left to themselves. On my last evening, I walked to the fence and stood there in the cooling air, looking out over that pale expanse. The smell that came off it was not rot or chemical, just an absence of smell, the way a room feels after something has been removed from it. I drove out the next morning before the sun was fully up. Our next story. I came to Coldwell Notch in early April, when the snow had mostly melted but the cold had not, leaving everything gray and damp and slightly wrong. I was mapping old postal routes for a historical archive, a quiet job that took me through towns most people had stopped remembering. Coldwell Notch was small even by those standards, maybe 200 people arranged around a single road that ran along a frozen creek. The locals were kind enough. They fed me at the diner and gave me directions without being asked. But there was one question none of them would answer, and I did not realize it was one question until my third day there. The church at the north end of town had no door. Not a locked door, not a boarded door. The frame was simply empty, open to the air, and the inside was completely bare. No pews, no altar, no fixtures of any kind. Just pale walls and a concrete floor swept, so clean it seemed almost deliberate. I asked the woman at the diner about it. She refilled my coffee and changed the subject so smoothly I almost missed the seam. I asked the man at the hardware store. He nodded slowly and found something to organize on the shelf behind him. I asked the boy who raked gravel outside the motel, and he just looked at me for a long moment before walking back inside. On my last night, I lay in bed listening to the creek and watching the ceiling and thinking about how the church had no dust either. No leaves blown in by the wind. No birds nesting in the rafters. Nothing accumulating at all. Whatever had been removed from that building had not simply been removed. It felt more like something had been kept out, steadily, carefully, for a very long time. Our next story. I rented a room in Varnfield for 9 days in late August, when the heat had turned the fields the color of old bone. My car had broken a belt somewhere along the county road, and the mechanic, a quiet man named Osler, told me the part would take time to arrive. I did not ask how much time. Something in his expression suggested I should not. The town was small and orderly in a way that felt deliberate. Lawns trimmed to the same length. Curtains drawn to the same depth. People smile when you pass them on the sidewalk, but they smile with their mouths only, and they did not slow their walking. There was an old grain elevator on the south edge of town, half collapsed, ringed by a chain-link fence. I noticed that no one walked on the side of the street closest to it. They crossed over before reaching it and crossed back after, without looking, without breaking conversation, as if the detour were simply how that stretch of road worked. I asked about it once, over coffee at the diner. The woman behind the counter refilled my cup and said the elevator had been out of use for years. She did not say what it had been used for before. She moved to the other end of the counter and stayed there. On my last night, I woke sometime before dawn and stood at the window. The town was perfectly still, but there was a light inside the elevator, faint and amber, moving slowly behind the slats. Not flickering, moving, like something carrying it from one end to the other. In the morning, Osler called to say the part had arrived. I was on the road before noon. I have not looked up Varnfield since. I think that is probably the right decision. Our next story. I stopped in Laro for a single night in mid-November, when the fields had gone brown and the sky pressed low against the rooftops like something heavy resting there. The town was small enough that the diner, the hardware store, and the post office all shared the same short block, and the motel at the far end of Main Street smelled of cedar and old radiator heat. I asked the woman at the front desk about a photograph I had noticed on the community board near the door. It showed a stretch of local road, maybe half a mile outside of town, and the road in the picture simply ended. Not a barrier or a field or a tree line. It just ended, the asphalt stopping cleanly in the middle of open land, with nothing beyond it but pale sky. She handed me my room key without looking up. She said something about it being an old photo and moved to the back room before I could ask anything else. I tried at the diner the next morning. A man in a green work jacket listened to my question and then looked down into his coffee and stirred it slowly for a long time. He said he supposed roads get built for all kinds of reasons, and some of them just do not go anywhere in the end. He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed. I drove out that afternoon before leaving and found a road easily enough. It looked exactly like the photograph. The asphalt ended in a clean straight line, and the grass beyond it was undisturbed, no ruts, no gravel scatter, nothing to suggest any kind of turning around. I stood there for a while in the cold and thought about what it would mean to build something that was never meant to arrive.